Hello and welcome to the New Lines podcast. I'm Faisal Al Yafai, and this is a podcast where we delve into some of the biggest ideas, events, and personalities in the Middle East and beyond. Today I'm joined by the Pakistani writer and novelist Fatima Bhutto. Bhutto is the author of the novels The Runaways and The Shadow of the Crescent Moon. Her latest book is The New Kings of the World: Dispatches from Bollywood, Dizi, and K-pop, which explores the rising popularity of the new pop cultural movements coming out of Asia. Bhutto is, of course, also part of the renowned Pakistani political dynasty. Her grandfather, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, was president of the country. Her father, Murtaza, was a parliamentarian, and her aunt, Benazir Bhutto, was prime minister. Fatima's first book, Songs of Blood and Sword, dealt with her family's complex history and the assassination of her father. After Benazir Bhutto was assassinated in 2007, many wondered whether Fatima would succeed her and follow a political path. But Fatima has instead pursued her own very successful literary career. Yet in both her fiction and her nonfiction, political issues have nevertheless been at the forefront of her writing. Fatima Bhutto, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Faisal. It's great to be with you.
I want to start with dangerous ideas. You said some ideas are too dangerous to do except in novel form. Give me an example of an idea that is too dangerous except in a novel.
Well, I think anytime you are dealing with, as you said, political ideas, they're, flammable ideas. They're not always fireproof. And so my first novel was really about the idea of home. What will you tolerate in your home, and what will you refuse? And I think those are quite dangerous ideas, because when you let people question things, there's really no limit to what point they can reach.
Hmm.
Even to talk about radicalism and to say this is not to do with Muslims, this is not to do with Islam, this is an issue of anger, and this is an issue of alienation and isolation. I think to say that outside of a narrative parameter can make people really uncomfortable. It can make people really angry. But they hear things differently when they come to them in stories.
You mean that the discomfort comes from going away from the prevailing wisdom, the prevailing narrative?
Yes, I think anytime you're questioning a prevailing narrative, or you're suggesting a new way of looking at something, or you're simply putting an idea into conflict with another one, that can be. I think it's an exciting thing, but I think many people can view it as also a threatening um, issue, or a threatening. It can have threatening possibilities.
And so you think in some ways it's easier to do that in fiction?
Well, I think to write anything in fiction is much harder, but I think it's more palatable to people to read it in fiction. Um, I think we let our guards down with fiction. I think, I always say fiction is a kind of Trojan horse. You can pack a novel with all kinds of things, and people don't really see what's coming for them until it's too late.
You seem quite interested in exploring political ideas.
Mhm.
You were talking about radicalism. That was from the novel The Runaways.
Mhm.
The Shadow of the Crescent Moon is about the war on terror. What do you think draws you to political subjects like that?
Well, I think it would be impossible to live in the world that we do and not be um, motivated by political impulses. Politics is in everything, and I suppose it's always been, well, for me, it's a natural way of looking at things. What you can say, what you can't say, what you watch, what you don't watch, where your solidarity is, how you dress. All those things are political, I think. And if we think of life as um, a series of actions which come out of some kind of union or brotherhood or allegiances, then what are those if not political, really, at the end? But I suppose you always end up writing what it is that you wish you could read. And
Hmm.
I'm drawn to those kind of stories. I'm drawn to things that maybe aren't exactly as they seem, that are about the turbulences of inner lives. And I suppose you could say those are not political, but I think they are.
You say that you're drawn to subjects that aren't exactly what they seem. That
Mhm.
could, some people could interpret that as being both about yourself and about the country that you live in.
Well, I think,
Is that a stretch too far? Am I psychoanalyzing it?
no person is what they seem, are they? We are not what we seem to ourselves, forget about to strangers. Of course, countries are not what they seem. Countries are built on mythologies, on Genesis stories, whether those are connected to reality or not. I think the process of life is about aspiring to a certain creation, whether that's a creation of the self or a creation of the state. And I guess the process of life is whether you live up to that or not, and how you stumble and where you succeed and where you fail.
Do you think that your writing is primarily a form of political expression? Are you trying to you said that the beauty of fiction is that you can approach people with ideas that perhaps they wouldn't be open to otherwise. Are you
Mm.
trying to reach an audience that may not be engaging with nonfiction sources of news and so on, or they might be hostile to the message you are writing about?
Um, no, I don't really see it that way when I'm sitting down to write. When I sit down to write, I'm writing because an idea has bothered me. It's disturbed me in some way, whether that's a haunting, or it's an inspiring or invigorating idea. It's something that I'm curious about and for some reason can't let go of. So that's really why I sit down to work on one idea over another. And I
Mm.
never really have the intention to say, I think this, and now you must also. I, I'm just chasing something that interests me, and the things that interest me tend to be things that are politically unusual or maybe counter currents, and so those are the things that naturally I tend to want to follow.
Yeah, I think there's a danger sometimes when you're writing fiction, particularly you're writing fiction about large political topics like the war on terror and radicalization, these sorts of things. The politics can sometimes overwhelm the fiction. I wonder if you feel that that is somewhere, where
Yeah.
your writing and your characters become archetypes and the story becomes like a morality tale.
Well, I think that's exactly what you want to avoid. You don't want to be moralizing to anyone, and that's really where the hard work in fiction comes in. Is that ultimately you're writing about the inner lives of people and the struggles that people battle when they are alone. And so you may have a larger political idea like radicalism, but at the end of the day, the Runaways is really about young lives and young lives lived in a world on fire. Um, and so I think at the end of the day, it's may have political shadows and political backgrounds, but in order for fiction to be truly felt, it has to be about the life of the heart, rather than the life of big things, of fertilized things.
How do you? I like that of capitalized things. Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
But how do you manage to avoid falling into that trap when you're writing these characters?
Oh, well, I think, if everyone published their first draft, they would end up with a whole host of problems. And I think you avoid these pitfalls by simply rewriting and rewriting and redoing and rethinking and undoing and redoing until you've polished your work to the point where you've hit the bone, you've hit exactly the nerve you wanted to hit, rather than just scratch the surface. And that for me is one of the biggest lessons that I keep learning as a writer, is that, the thing you finish in year one, it's not really ever what you want to say. In year two, you might be closer. And, the more years you have and the deeper you go into it, the closer it comes to the truth of what you're looking for.
Do you think also maybe you reach the truth not in book one, but in book two or book three?
Well, I suppose there are many different truths, because you don't really ever want to be writing the same story over and over again. You want to be dealing with different struggles and different explorations. So I think there's room for many different truths and many different investigations. I don't think it needs to be singular.
It might be that you might return to some of these topics, but in a different form.
Well, I don't know. I mean, personally, I can tell you that I don't want to write about radicalism again.
Mm.
I mean,
Yeah.
I spent 4 years thinking about it, and I I felt that I dedicated and sustained my attention to it for that time, and now I'm free of it. Now I'm not haunted by it. I'm not thinking about it. I'm thinking about other things.
Mm.
And so I don't know if we return, maybe in small ways, maybe in micro explorations. but I think one of the joys of being a writer is that you're constantly learning, and you're constantly being taken into new directions.
You do speak as if you love the process of writing, and I wonder if sometimes you feel that because of the name, you're being pigeonholed as a political writer when you are a writer in bold more.
I do really love the craft of writing, and I'm curious about what it means for someone to sit with a thought, and to trouble their own thoughts. So I do enjoy that very much, and I think that's probably what keeps me a writer all these years later, is that I can only bring that to the table. I can't bring any more than that. And if I were to start bringing in ideas of what people might think, or what people might read into what I'm saying based on my name, I think it would be debilitating. And so I'm lucky that I'm able to zone that out. And of course, people bring all kinds of things to anything they read. Whether it's written by someone from a political background, or someone from a totally normal background. So
Mm.
that, I think, it can't be helped. And the only thing you can do is be sincere in your own impulses, and hopefully that leads you somewhere honest.
Some science fiction writers, they'll if they're female, they'll use initials or something like that.
Sure.
Yeah. So it's that sort of thing that you're going to be judged by something anyway,
Well,
regardless.
yeah, I think so. I mean, I think we live in a world of judgment, and we're all experts about everything, as it turns out.
It turns out, yeah.
Social media has turned everybody into, a pundit overnight. Anything that happens in the world, by the next morning, Susan from Iowa, is an expert on it. That's sort of fun in a way, but it's also exhausting, and it would be untenable to keep up with that kind of thing. So I think we have to be led by our own interests, and hope that eventually we're really talking about human experiences, and that's what will touch people, rather than who in particular wrote about that experience.
Yeah, you mentioned social media. I wonder. I mean, you're very good on social media. You have a large following, of course, but you're quite active on social media. And I wondered if that impacts the way you write, because a lot of the writing that you do is very. It requires a lot of careful, almost solitary thought, which is something that social media is very bad at.
Yeah, it's really bad, and I'm as guilty as anyone in that every day I think I'm not gonna look at Twitter, and then, at some point you find yourself down some kind of rabbit hole, reading a 45-part thread about something, completely absurd.
Yeah,
But I try to dose it. When I'm working, I try really hard not to spend too much time, um, in social media, just because I think it just makes us stupider. It's fast, and when you're thinking, you can't move at that pace. You need to be, as you said, solitary, reflective, introspective, and yeah, I think the pandemic has been quite good at souring a lot of people's love affair with with social media,
with
me
social media,
included.
almost too much of it.
Yeah, it's too much, and it's too much of the same thing, and it's getting tiring. I don't know if you remember the big shipping, containers that were stuck,
Of course,
and
yeah.
and there were
In the
these
Suez,
in the Suez, and there were these
the
great
Amendment.
memes. There were these fantastic memes, in that typical kind of color, bright social media, design of, "Are you worried about what's happening in the Suez? Here's how you can help." And, you click the next image, and it's like, "You can't help. There's absolutely nothing you can do.
You
Go
can't
away."
help. Yeah, yeah.
And I think we have reached that point, haven't we, in late technology, where it's really too exhausting. I mean, how much can we do this for?
Yeah, one of our team members makes a point about this, that people feel the desire to signal their views on big topics like Ukraine. They'll say, "I am not in favor of the invasion of Ukraine." And you're like, "Who's asking you, mate?" As you say, Susan from Idaho, who's asking you? You and your 24 Twitter followers.
Yeah, it's true, and I think it's such a wonderful thing to just be able to say, "I don't want to tell you my opinion," or "I have no
I
opinion
have
at this
no
time,"
opinion. Yeah, yeah,
or
yeah.
"My opinion is going to stay with me." And I
Hmm.
think, we all have opinions, of course, we have opinions about everything, but it doesn't mean that all of them are interesting or valid or need to be shared.
Hmm.
exactly at the moment we have them.
You said that once about fiction, that the beauty of writing fiction is that you get to have the idea and it's almost like a secret in yourself for a long period of time.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's true. Writing, as you said, is a very solitary, lonely act. But when you're working on nonfiction, as you know, you might interview people, you might um, talk to people, you might go out to find something, to observe something, and at any point that you're doing that, someone asks you what you're working on, and you can't say, "I won't tell you." You have to give them a little bit of information.
Yeah.
But to write fiction, is really to be alone with your thoughts, and that's probably what makes it so much harder. But it's also what makes it more magical in a strange way. I think it's really a rare moment where we are able to sustain attention to something for a significant period of time, and where we are challenging ourselves as people, to go beyond our initial reactions or our initial impulses. And to me, that's very exciting because I can't really think of many other occasions in life where you're allowed to do that, except writing fiction.
Mm. You started teaching as well recently. You now teach classes on political fiction. I
Yeah.
wonder, yeah,
Hmm.
I wonder if you think that there's something different about writing political fiction as opposed to another type of writing.
Well, with the pandemic, things sort of changed a little bit, and the things that we used to do in the before times, like do talks or do book events or travel and go to literary festivals, all kind of migrated online. And I taught a few writing courses, and I did two on, or maybe I did more than two. I can't remember now, on political fiction. And I think there is an idea that it's non-Western writers that write political fiction. That Western writers are allowed to write about, a mother and a relationship and childhood and all those kind of things. They're allowed to have these suburban stories of innocence and whatever.
Yeah.
And that it's Eastern, it's writers from the global South who are forced to grapple with politics. But I really don't want to read any stories about the mother at home baking lasagna or whatever. I mean, I think we've read so many of those. It's not that there's nothing interesting about that. It's that it's been done for so long. Um, and it's tiring, really. And I think that writers who are fighting the world around them are always going to be more interesting than that kind of solipsistic writer that's just thinking about themselves and their own life and their four walls around them. And those are always the stories that I'm interested in as a reader. And so I enjoy the idea of teaching. I enjoy the idea of talking to writers. Um, but I wanted to talk to writers who are maybe interested in the same thing and who want to talk about big things but aren't quite sure how to build them.
I guess one of the reasons why books about the internal lives of people within, as you say, the four walls, one of those reasons why so many Western writers gravitate towards that is that, frankly, people don't need to worry in the West about the outside world imposing upon those four walls. That's
Mm.
something that you grapple with yourself in terms of, I mean, the war on terror, in terms of your relationship with Pakistan and the American experience.
Mm. Well, I think it's a mistake for Western writers to think they don't have to worry about the outside world because, of course, we've seen they very much do, and the world is changing, and power is changing in the world, and the West is not going to be what the West was very soon. We already see so many threats and challenges and anxieties creeping over the West.
Mm,
So I think it's probably time to start thinking beyond their four walls, but I think the rest of us have always had that sense, that we're under threat from somewhere or something,
mm,
and that threat sometimes is nameable, sometimes it's not nameable, but that we are connected, to borders far beyond our own in good ways and in 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 less good ways, in dangerous ways. And I think to recognize that is not a bad thing. I think it's an important thing, and all the interesting writing that I can think of the last few years, um, seems to be working within that space.
You would very much situate yourself as a writer from the global south. Is that right?
Well, yes, I mean, I'm Pakistani you know, I've most of my life has been spent either in Syria, where I grew up as a child, or in Pakistan, and I've of course lived abroad and studied abroad, and um, but but that's not where I see myself as belonging to now.
You move very seamlessly though between those two worlds or those multiple worlds. I mean, I certainly get the sense that you are as comfortable. You studied in New York. You're as
Mm.
comfortable in New York as as you are in Lahore or Islamabad.
I that's probably true. That's probably fair to say, and I think I think there's no place where one is truly comfortable or one is truly at home. You know, there are things that make me uncomfortable in Lahore, and there are things that make me uncomfortable in America. Um, and and that's, I mean, you know, I tend to travel a lot, or at least I did travel a lot. And part of the education of travel is that you never really know what makes you uncomfortable until you experience it. But, you know, of course, the post 9/11 years changed that a lot because it didn't matter what you felt. It was also how you were seen.
Mm. Your latest book, New Kings of the World, is nonfiction and explores how American pop culture is losing its global dominance to a new wave of Asian cultural imports, Bollywood movies, Turkish soap operas, K-pop from Korea, and so on. And
Mhm.
you argue that these are successful because they speak to an audience who are still living through the transition between traditional ways of life and quote unquote modernity.
Mhm.
What do you mean by this transition to modernity?
Well, I think it's assumed, you know, when people talk about globalization, we talk about it often in this kind of flippant way, you know. It's a state of understanding, it's a state of being, it's entirely positive, it's dynamic, and you're either in it or you're out. But it's an incredibly turbulent path, the path of globalization. And for every passenger that it takes to some kind of summit, it drowns hundreds of others underneath its enormous pressures and anxieties and difficulties. And and so this is important in many ways. We see it in so many places in the real world, in real politics. But when we talk about culture and we talk about what it is that people are responding to, it's quite clear that American culture, American pop culture, which you know generations have grown up on, myself included, at one point was aspirational. It spoke to that journey, you know, an aspirational journey to a place of opportunity and wealth and comfort and ease, a frictionless ease. But reality, of course, is one thing, and that promise I don't think was very much built in reality. So who benefits from that promise? You know, who is living the life of friends in New York thanks to
Mm,
globalization? But but really, what most people struggle through is the Squid Games journey. You know, this
mm,
unwinnable, exhausting, um, terrorizing passage. That's really the experience of most of the foot soldiers of globalization. And so where are they seeing that? And you know, they're not seeing it in American television shows. They're not seeing it in American movies. The way that America used to be able to speak to people's experiences or dreams has changed. And other cultures and other countries are figuring that out, and they're doing a much better job. They're more sophisticated at talking to that terrorizing passage than Western pop culture.
well, the two examples you gave of Friends and then now of Squid Game are quite good because actually they speak. Squid Game particularly speaks to people within the West as well, because as you say, it's not the case that all Americans are living the life of Friends. Some of them are living the life of Squid Game.
Absolutely, absolutely. In a place where a COVID hospitalization bill can reach $1 million, you know, or can reach hundreds of thousands of dollars, of course they're living in a real life Squid Game. And it
Mm,
was it was it was really odd to see all these American articles after Squid Game became the viral show that it is,
Yeah.
saying, "Oh, Squid Game reminds, Asians of North Korea." No, it doesn't. It actually reminds them of South Korea. It is based in South Korea. This is the
Yeah, yeah.
story of capitalism. This is
Mm.
not the story of communism. This is very specifically about, the climb to neoliberal,
Yeah.
wealth.
Yeah, very much so. It reminds Americans of America, actually.
Absolutely, and so, it was quite funny to see that, being written by perhaps the same people who were lauding the show as as hard hitting. I mean, I don't know what they were thinking when they were watching it. But but this is the world we live in, and, if you're looking at what's coming out of Korea, I mean, obviously Parasite is another great example that, got a lot of attention.
Yeah.
It speaks to that anxiety. It speaks to that um, completely unstable ground, and that so many people are trying to build lives upon, in a way that I can't think of what the American equivalent would be. At least not anything I can think of in recent years.
Yeah, maybe not something from the studios in Hollywood.
Yeah, yeah, more independent films perhaps,
Mm.
but New Kings of the World was really about mass culture. It wasn't about independent culture, because if we're talking about indie culture, that's a whole separate story. We're talking about, the number of eyeballs on a show or on a production, and culture itself works so incredibly quickly, that if I was rewriting New Kings of the World today, I would change the countries up. Actually, I wouldn't focus. I wouldn't do India anymore because
Mm.
Bollywood has been obliterated by the Indian right wing. It's not the same thing it was when I wrote the book. I mean, already then it had changed, um, but it's another thing altogether today.
You open the book with a quote from the Ayatollah Khomeini, who's not a man usually associated with K-pop. But the quote says, the quote says, "In a country, the road to reform travels through culture."
Mm.
Why do you think that was the quote that needed to open the book in particular?
Oh, I like the idea that Khomeini said it. And and I think, at the time, if we think of when he said it, it's a very prescient thing to say. And and I think it's true, we come to culture innocently. We come to culture as spectators and as people who want to be entertained. But the makers of culture are not acting in innocence. They are acting, with quite specific intentions. And those intentions, of course, can be personal, that they want to put forward an idea. But let's also not forget that cultural industries receive a lot of government funding. The CIA has a department, for film writers, script writers, for movie makers. And if you're telling a story that's particularly interesting to the CIA, they'll help you. They'll give you funding. They'll help you with research. They might even help you with like hardware. Um,
Yeah,
films like Zero Dark 30, of course, benefited from these offices.
yeah.
Um, and I don't know why we think only the Russians are doing that, or only the Chinese are doing that. No, the Americans are doing it, the French are doing it, the Israelis are doing it, everyone's doing that. So we have to look at culture, also through what politics are being pushed through these products. What ways are they trying to change our thinking? And it's really quite a sophisticated and insidious thing that's happening there.
Well, one of the examples you give is of Turkish television, the soap operas,
Mhm.
and you describe the heroes of these soap operas as in a way that I thought was quite insightful. It says that they are modern but not westernized, and I
Mhm.
thought that was quite an important distinction. But it's also a distinction that is often flattened. So I think
Mhm.
it's important to talk about what the distinction actually is. What does it mean to you to be modern but not westernized?
Well, it's so many things, isn't it? I mean, we're all modern in the sense that we're working in global economies. We are, fluid and flexible. We are tied completely to technology, right? So we are not living, in a backwards era. But at the same time, what does it mean not to be Western? I think for a lot of us people in the global South, we associate that with a lack of tradition, with a lack of ethics, if not morality. A Turkish hero drives a BMW or drives a Mercedes. He drives a fast car. He works in a bank. He has an iPhone. He lives in a city. All those things are modern. But when his mother enters the room, he stands up. When his grandfather comes into the room, he kisses his hand. When it's a choice between himself and his own comfort and the success and safety of the family, he will always choose the family. When it comes to yielding or resisting corruption, he will do it not just for himself, but for the society that has protected him until that point. So I think that's what the Turks have done incredibly successfully, is that they have their shows and their heroes and their characters. Of course, I don't mean in the historical epics, but in the sort of modern tales. These are people who are living in the 21st century. They are children of the 21st century, but they are not a wayward generation. They are not a corrupted generation. They are still led by a certain kind of ideal and principle and value. And that's what makes them so beloved to audiences all around the world.
But do you see in that a certain element of propaganda in the way that you've talked
Oh,
about it existing with the Americans?
of course, of course. As I said, everyone is doing it. Turkey is reimagining itself in its television shows. You would be forgiven, I think, to watch a Turkish Dizi and then be confused upon landing in Ankara to find that it doesn't exactly look like what you've been watching all this time. But that's what everyone is doing. They're reimagining themselves. They're telling new stories about who they are, what their country means, and what it is like to live there, what it is like to live well in their countries. And I think that's quite an important thing to do, actually, for a lot of our own countries. And I always say this about mine. In Pakistan, we have constantly this problem of our incredibly rich heritage of artists and filmmakers, singers, writers butting up against censorship. And I always think, why would you want to show the story of yourself as insecure? Um, show the story of yourself as confident, as being brave in the world, as not being threatened by your own ideas. Show a new story. Why can't there be 10 different stories of Pakistan? And one can be modern, one can be conservative, one can be whatever.
Mm.
In order for us to rethink where we are going, I think we have to allow that we have many different types of existing in whether it's Turkey or Pakistan or the Middle East. And all those ways are valid. We live in them every day. If you're living in the Middle East, you know how diverse society is and how different religions and different backgrounds and different ways of thinking coexist in an unusual perhaps, but in a very sophisticated kind of harmony and
Mm.
symmetry. Why shouldn't our culture show that too?
What then do you think are the political implications of this cultural movement then? If you look at the big picture and you say, well, what changes will happen in the world when Hollywood and the version of the world that Hollywood is putting out is no longer dominant in global culture?
Well, I think it's early to say really what the effects are. But if we look at, for example, those of us who are not American, if we look at what we know about America or what we think about America, how much of that is built from American culture? I mean, a massive amount, I would say. This idea of America as a land of opportunity, as a democracy, as a place where anything is possible, and you can be a street sweeper one day and then the president the next. This was being fed to us night and day by their films, by their shows that made us laugh and cry and want to be a part of their story. So, who's going to tell the best story now? I think that will be interesting. I don't know what the answer is, but I think it
Mm.
will change what it is we seek in the world, what it is that we will aspire to, what kind of lives we will want to build, and what kind of communities um, we will dream of being a part of. I think that's all very much up for grabs at the moment. Interestingly.
I wanted to talk a bit about your personal life. You're on the record as saying that you wouldn't be a writer if it wasn't for your father.
Yeah.
You said, this is the quote, "I wouldn't have the confidence to do any of what is required to be a writer had it not been for my father." What did your father give you that was so vital?
Um, so many things really. It was my father who, from as early as I can remember, not only allowed me to have a voice, but encouraged it, and never put it down. Never told me, "Oh, don't say that," or "You mustn't speak now," or "This isn't, this is a place for adults," or he always encouraged me to talk and always made me feel that I had a right to whatever it was I thought, whether he agreed or anyone else agreed. I had a right to defend myself and I had a right to question things. And I think for a woman, that's an incredibly important thing to teach um, a young girl, to teach a child. But at the same time that he did that, it was also that he met whatever I said with a great sense of freedom. So I was allowed to say things to my father and not feel afraid. And I think to be a writer, you do need that. I think to be secure in the world, you need that. It's not to say that he told me I was always right. There's plenty of disagreement and plenty of questioning. Um, but to feel safe, to feel encouraged, to feel that you have something to say, um, these are lessons that my father was killed when I was very young, but they've carried me through my entire life, through the many years I've had to live without him. And on another level, it was he who took me to libraries first. And I remember very much the first time he took me to a library. He treated it with so much um, respect. It was such a sacred place, and it was such a solemn moment that I remember thinking I was about to be a part of something extraordinary, and that's never left me. And I'm glad he did that. I'm glad my father didn't do that to me with things, with objects, or with um, ephemeral things, things that don't last or that don't mean anything. I'm so glad he did that to me with books, because it's been a refuge and it's been a place of great joy for me to have whatever life has has taken me through. There's always been that refuge.
You speak with obviously a great deal of warmth about your father. I would imagine that obviously his assassination must have been a pivotal moment in your life, perhaps the pivotal moment in your life. Do you think that there are echoes of that experience in your work?
I think so. I think a lot of my work touches on well, on a kind of sadness perhaps, or a loneliness, and there is violence. It has touched on violent shocks, and one is always trying to understand, I guess, what the things that bother us and the things that hurt us. And in that sense, yes, um, it would be impossible to avoid in my work. And in many years, it's been impossible to avoid in my life. But um, I suppose grief is a movable thing, and at times it feels overwhelming and incredibly sad and suffocating, and at other times grief is a reminder of treasure and of things that we loved and moments of great joy. And life, I suppose, is about moving between those two poles.
You've published very widely, but you're still a young writer. I was surprised actually to think that you haven't written anything that features your father as a character. And I wondered if that was interesting to me because, of course, your father was a very public figure. So I
Mm.
thought that would might be a way of reclaiming it, in a private way.
Mm. Well, my first proper book was about my father's life and his assassination, and so I don't know. I've never thought about it actually, but I suppose that was the book really that I wrote about my father and I wrote for my father. But no, it's never occurred to me really to write about him in any other way. Maybe because, as with anything we love, some part of it is always there anyways, in less visible ways, whatever it is we do.
It would be strange to talk about political fiction with you without talking about political fact.
Mm,
And you are a member of a political dynasty that is inextricably linked with the history of modern Pakistan. Do
mm.
you feel connected to that dynasty, since it seems you have taken several steps away from it?
Well, there's always a big gulf between, I suppose, looking at something from inside and from outside. From my vantage point, it's not a dynasty; it's a family in the same way anyone else would have a family. Um, it's populated by people rather than um, by how powerful those people are or were. Um, Whereas from the outside, it might look more strategic or you know
Yeah.
acts of great decision. For me, growing up, I always wanted to be a writer. It was always the thing I dreamed of doing, and so I feel very fortunate to be able to do what it is I love. Um, if tomorrow I felt very strongly that I wanted to, be more political or work directly in politics, then I would do that. So it's not really a question of, you know, making distance or keeping distance. This is just really always where I've intended to head, and I feel good about that decision so far. I mean, but you never you never know, I
No.
guess.
Is that something, though, that you could imagine being involved in some way in politics?
I don't really know because I get asked all the time, and the truth is, I never have the same answer, because if you catch me on one day, the answer is no, and if you catch me on another, the answer could be maybe. It really depends. I think at the moment, and by moment I mean the last 20 years, in this period, I really feel that my interests and um, my way of being political has been served well by writing. It has allowed me to talk about exactly the things I want to talk about. It's allowed me the freedom to say exactly what I think, and to be true to what I think. And so I don't feel I'm missing anything at the moment.
Actually, that was something I was going to ask, because you said in an interview once that writing is a form of doing, and of
Yeah.
course politics is doing. I wonder if it's reasonable to see your work as the continuation of politics by other means.
I think so. I mean, it's not that I set out to do that. Um, But when I write an op-ed piece, for example, or when I write a long essay about something, like, for example, the remaining Pakistani prisoners in Guantanamo, that to me is quite a political act. It is saying that if there is a line in the sand, this is where I stand, according to that line. Um, and it requires obviously a clear thought about where you want to stand and why you want to stand there. And so for me, that's as political as anything else would be. But obviously, there is a difference between writing about something and being on the ground. It's not that I think they're equal; they serve different purposes. Um, but how we think about ourselves, how we think about our countries, how we think about our responsibilities and our roles, I think writing is an important part of that.
I think it would be fair to say that your life has been scarred by violence. That's not an unfair thing to say, is it?
No,
No.
that would be quite correct. Yeah.
And I think, but yet when I hear you speak, you seem very controlled, very optimistic, very open to the joys of the world. You certainly seem to find joy in popular culture, as we see in the book, across many cultures. I
Hmm.
wonder how you reconcile your lived experience with that optimism and that openness to the world. Because it wouldn't be an unreasonable thing for someone who has experienced some of the challenges that you have to retreat from the world to some degree.
Well, I think you asked me earlier about my father and what it was he gave me. And one of the vital things he gave me was a sense that the world is a beautiful place and a just place, and that we have to move in it with a kind of gentleness and reverence and wonder. And so just because bad things have happened to me is not a reason to set fire to the world. It's obviously traumatic, and it's obviously something that has caused pain, but I think it would be a disservice, really, not just to me, but to the many people who I loved, who gave their lives to live in bitterness and in anger and unhappiness. For whatever bad things happened and whatever violence was close to me, I've also been incredibly lucky. I've been incredibly lucky to have love and guidance and be given a certain way of thinking and seeing the world. And so I feel it's a duty um, to hold on to that and to always try and see beyond one's own pain. Uh, of course, it's a process. It is not to say that one is bulletproof or immune from being shattered. We are always shattered. I certainly have been. Um, but when one is shattered, one can rebuild. And as long as we're alive, I think we have a duty to keep rebuilding.
You say you have a sense of duty to that idea. Do you feel you have a sense of duty to Pakistan? I mean, your family's been involved in politics, and even though I said earlier that you see yourself as somebody, as a member of the global South, I think it's probably also fair to say you do situate yourself very much as a Pakistani.
Yes, and I am, and I think that in in certain ways we all have duties, not just me, but all Pakistanis have duties to their country. But Pakistan also has a duty to us, and so I take it as a real relationship in a sense. It's not only that ought to be at the service of our country, but our country ought to also be at the service of its people. What is Pakistan without any of us? What is Pakistan without all its sons and daughters? And I do think we struggle on both sides to keep faith sometimes with that duty or that connection. Um, but I do have it, and I do feel it, and I do feel again that my country has given me so much, has taught me so much, has really made me the person I am. If I hadn't grown up in Karachi, um, you know, I would be a different person. I'd be a more fragile person, maybe. I'd be a more frightened person. So I'm grateful. Um, and I guess as one gets older, that kind of duty changes or it evolves in different ways. And it's been it's been it has been a relationship of great evolution, I would say.
When you say that the country has a duty towards its people, it sounds as if you are edging towards a criticism of the political culture. And you have criticized Pakistan's political
Mhm.
culture in the past. You don't necessarily seem to wade into day to day arguments, though. I wonder if
Mm.
you feel that that's because that's not your place as a writer, or because you are more comfortable talking about the ideas rather than the policy.
It's been some years that when I was writing, for example, a newspaper column in Pakistan for a Pakistani paper, I did wade into more day-to-day issues because you've got to write something every week, so
Right.
you're responding to things at a different rate. Um, so there are times I have done that, and then there are times I haven't. When I haven't, it's also because there's only 24 hours in the day, and you really can't spend all of them arguing about everything that happens. Sometimes the thing that happens has happened before, and you've already said what you had to say about it. Um, but if there's anything I feel strongly about, then I do say it. I mean, there are things obviously that I don't comment on because I'm still learning, because I'm not sure what I think, and I'd like to watch and read and listen and learn more before I enter a conversation personally.
I wanted to ask you a bit about Afghanistan.
Mhm.
You were born in Kabul, so I imagine the events of the past year have been very impactful for you. What did it feel like watching the Taliban retake control of the city that you were born in?
Well, I've tried for years to go back to Afghanistan, and gosh, I mean, more than 10 years, I mean, since 2008, 7, 6, I've been trying to go back, and it's never happened for one reason or the other. So it's a place that has a great emotional resonance for me, but I've never been as an adult. I was just a few months old when we left. Um, but to watch what happened last summer really was extraordinary, and I don't think one necessarily had to. I imagine it's what people felt during the Vietnam era. The idea of an empire um, being brought to its knees is a is an extraordinary thing to watch. Whether you are part of that empire, you're outside it, you're a critic, you're a supporter of it. It is extraordinary to watch, and for me to watch what happened in Afghanistan was a really important reminder that for for whatever power one has, for whatever military technological prowess one might have, when you go to fight people in their homes, you can't win. You
Do
just
you
can't.
think
Mm.
do you think let's say, the exposure of the empire's feet of clay will have a knock-on impact around the world?
I think it's having it right now with Russia and Ukraine. If America had not said it will be 3 months before the Taliban take Kabul, only to be proved wrong in 6 days, would Russia be doing what they're doing in Ukraine? I don't think so. I think we're watching all these sparks fire off, and I think we will have many more of these sparks in the coming years.
I heard a quote from the late science fiction writer Ursula Le Guin that I wanted to share with you because I think it's relevant, not just for Afghanistan, but for what we're talking about more widely.
Mm.
The quote is: "Hard times are coming when we'll be wanting the voices of writers who can see alternatives to how we live now, can see through our fear stricken society and its obsessive technologies to other ways of being, and even imagine real grounds for hope. We'll need writers who can remember freedom, poets, visionaries, realists of a larger reality." Does that in some way resonate with you, this need for alternative visions?
Oh yeah, that it's wonderful to hear Ursula K. Le Guin. Yeah, it resonates very strongly with me. The only thing that I'm not sure writers ever really provide any solutions, but I do think they see through. They see through all the neuroses and all the artifice of our societies and our worlds, and I do think they're valuable in seeing through those things to what it is that we all want, hope, survival, justice, peace. I think writers are necessary for that. And even if I wasn't a writer, it would give me sustenance to be able to read writers like Le Guin, especially in dark and troubled times.
I wanted to end on a personal note by asking you about your fondness for dogs. It's something that definitely comes through from your Twitter account.
Yes, I do. In my old age, I've become really one of those kind of people who thinks about animals a lot. I didn't used to be. I always loved dogs, but I think I've become very attuned to the world of dogs and animals because there's a cruelty all around us that I think we've become numb to. Maybe part of that is social media, that we're not only reading our own newspapers, we're getting information from all over the world. And we have understood the world to be a cruel place. And so we tolerate it in so many ways. And I think we live in an angry time. And I think people are angry for plenty of good reasons because, like we said, the world is uncertain. People struggle to feed their families. People struggle to make lives of dignity and honor, and that anger is coming out in frightening ways. And I think part of it is through this cruelty, which is now touching almost everything that humans can touch. And what we have done to the natural world, what we do to the wild world, even the domesticated, tamed, formerly wild world, I think is something we ought to watch. Um, and it's something we ought to watch because we ought to be better. And we ought to be better all the time, and our failings towards animals and the planet is is a really big sign of that for me. Plus, I just love dogs, but yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you wrote a very moving piece called "The Hour of the Wolf" about your dog Coco. It's, I
Yes.
mean, it's about your dog, but it's also about grief and loss and compassion and what our relationships with animals say. And near the end of that essay, you ask yourself why you're not writing about serious things.
Hmm.
But it's clear that you really do regard this as a serious thing. And when you break it down into kind of its constituent beliefs, like the belief in the importance of empathy, in caring for the innocent, in not abusing power, and care for the natural world, as you were saying, it seems to me that your love for animals is really a core foundational value of your worldview.
It is, and it has certainly grown and grown and expanded in size. Um, so much of what we've lived through in the last 2 years, a lot of it is really down to a lot of selfishness. We see it every day that people who are healthy think nothing about people who are not. People don't want to inconvenience themselves so that others might not get ill. It makes me despair, and then you see animals who are creatures of forgiveness and total love, really, and acceptance. Um and it's a reminder of how bad we have been with each other as people, how unthinking and how careless we have been with each other, for me. So I do take it pretty seriously, and I've learned a lot. I mean, I have 3 dogs, and I've learned so much from them about, as you said, about abusing power, about what it means to be thoughtful, about what care means, about what our responsibilities to weaker things ought to be, and how often we fail.
Fatima Bhutto, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Fatima's latest book is New Kings of the World, Dispatches from Bollywood, Dizi, and K-pop, and can be found in all good bookshops. You can follow her on Twitter at @fbhutto. This week's podcast was produced by Joshua Martin and hosted by me, Faisal Al Yafai. You can subscribe to the New Lines Magazine podcast on your favorite podcast app. And of course, you can find more of the best stories from the Middle East and beyond on our website, newlinesmag.com. Thank you all for joining us.